Hello, everyone. I see that people are still coming into the virtual space for the conversation, and that's just great. It is 7 o'clock, and we're going to go ahead and get started. Good evening. I am so glad that you're joining us tonight, for those of you who are here virtually, and for those who will be watching this recording later. Thank you for joining both myself and Hoa Nguyen in this important conversation. I want to welcome you all to this brand new conversation series to the Department of English at the University of Cincinnati, entitled Poetry as Radicalization and Liberation for BIPOC and Marginalized People. I'm the host, Felicia Zamora, poet and assistant professor here. This series searches for a collective exploration of poetry's role in activism and social change, specifically from contemporary poets whose role in whose art directly reflects these inquiries. This conversation has been made possible by support from the Charles Phelps Taft Research Center, the Arts and Sciences Faculty Development Award in the Vice Provost's Office, and the Latino Faculty Association at the University of Cincinnati. On behalf of our communities, we acknowledge the Cincinnati area and the land that the University of Cincinnati has been built on is the native homeland of the indigenous Algonquin tribes, including the Delaware, Miami, and Shawnee tribes. Before we begin tonight's conversation, we are excited in the English department to be hosting a stellar lineup of authors for this spring, including the 2022 Elliston Poet in Residence, Hyde E. Erdrich, author of Little Big Bully, winner of the National Poetry Series and published by Penguin in 2020. Visiting Writers Series poet and editor and associate professor Divya Victor will be joining us virtually on February 16th at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, as well as additional poets for this conversation series, including poet and professor Dr. Danica Kelly and poet and professor Dr. Craig Santos Perez. Joining us today is my guest, poet and educator Hoa Nguyen. Ocean Vuong writes of Hoa Nguyen's work. Nguyen's work is a poetics insistent on fragmentation and rupture as a mode of thinking and being in the world. One where, paradoxically, the very notion of fragmentation is, in itself, a whole. Her poems remind us that meaning, as we understand it, does not need to have to adhere to standard conventions of syntax, thereby faithfully echoing the most pervasive and perennial human emotions of loss, displacement, serration, and perhaps most vital of all, a necessary sense of wonder and joy before the world. Born in the Mekong Delta, Hoa Nguyen was raised and educated in the United States and has lived in Canada since 2011. Nguyen's fifth book of poems, 1,000 Times You Lose Your Treasure, published by Wave Books in 2021, was named a finalist for the National Book Award in Poetry and the Governor General's Literary Award, and has garnered additional support from Publishers Weekly, the Poetry Foundation, Miss Magazine, and the Los Angeles Review of Books. Her other books include As Long as Trees Last, Red Juice, Poems 1998 to 2008, and Violet Energy Ingots, which received a 2017 Griffith Prize nomination. Her writing has been promoted by such outlets as Granta, PEN American Center, CBC Books, Boston Review, the Best Canadian Poetry Series, Poetry, The Walrus, and Pleiades. In 2019, she was nominated for a Neustadt International Prize for Literature. Nguyen has more than 20 years experience teaching across genres in intimate workshops and large lectures in community, undergraduate, and graduate settings. at places such as Princeton University, the Chautauqua Institute, Brown University, Miami University, the Milton Avery Graduate School of the Arts at Bard College MFA program, where she was named co-chair of writing in 2020, and many others. Since 2017, she has served as associated faculty for the University of Guelph Creative Writing MFA program. Please help me welcome Hoa Nguyen.
Thank you. Thank you for that great introduction and for having me.
I know it feels, I wanted to make sure that those who maybe haven't had an introduction to your work before sort of know of your awesomeness. Hoa, thank you so much for sharing virtual space and for conversing with me tonight. I'm going to start us off this conversation with a really large question. How are you? How have you been during these past 2 pandemic years? And specifically, like, how are you evolving and where is your art right now?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you again for having me, especially under the auspices of this new conversation series at the University of Cincinnati, under your stewardship. It's been hard years. I have too many jobs. I continue to be really active in terms of thinking about teaching and mentorship. Those are big aspects of my identity as a poet. During the pandemic, what's been interesting, some of my community teaching has been put on hold due to logistics and sort of the less capacity to add another like Zoom experience when one is also teaching on Zoom, but my practice has grown more focused on some of my collaborative activities. Since 2017, I've been a part of a group that it's a group of women writers of the Vietnamese diaspora, women and non-binary writers of the Vietnamese and Southeast Asian diaspora, called She Who Has No Masters. It's an offshoot group of the Diasporic Vietnamese Artist Network, which offers us support. And this collective's goal is to collaborate and create polyvocal and multi-genre or hybrid poetic works in an authorless way. In other words, our authorship is always collective. And so, and I've been working with them in different capacities since 2017. In the last 2 years since the pandemic, one of the projects we worked on under the curation of Diana Coy Nguyen and Dao Strom, who are members of the collective, and you might know Diana Coy Nguyen's Ghost of, which uses a form that she invents that also arises out of the impulse of the collection, which is these body texts, which are formed by the cutting out of an image from a family photograph. There was an exhibition in a Salt Lake City gallery. We collaborated on creating body text images as a group. These then later turned, it was a series called Would That. And this series later was featured in the most recent issue of Poetry. Also, were selected online in Hush if you want to see them. I think they're really powerful. And it was really powerful working with the collective. We were distributed, as we always are. Members are in the US and Canada, in Vietnam. And we, for the body text collaboration, we had copies of family photos, personal photos, that we, in a ritual together, cut out the forms, and we had to share a document that we would put the text into. And then later we came together to produce a sound and video piece. My contribution was timed with the spring equinox, stemming from a form of like creating a diasporic tracing,
Mhm.
where I transferred a tree shrine ceremony. That's a form of veneration to ancestors, also to the spirit of trees and wandering spirits that might take up into a tree. I performed the ritual in my backyard on a pear tree in our backyard. It was also just a few days after the shootings in Atlanta, as a form of grief being supported by the cycles. But I also included these video elements that linked me to my diasporic fellow creators. And then that was mixed into this collaborative video that we shared as part of a presentation for a conference on Asian American studies called Unsettling Trans-Pacific Ecologies. So these different kinds of things. Also, I want to be sure to mention that we're launching a mentorship initiative,
Right.
our collective, which will be free to participants. So that's another thing that I'm involved with, some foundational structural components, selecting and then mentoring this mentorship program for writers, women and non-binary writers of the Southeast Asian diaspora.
Oh, mentorship is such an important piece, I think, of community building. And from what I hear, yes, you have too many jobs, but also it sounds like your interests are steeped in that which is in mentorship, in collaboration, in community building. I just love this collaboration that you're talking about. And yeah, Diana Coy Wynn's work is, I'm a huge fan of. Diana Coy actually came to speak to one of my classes. I think it was in the spring of 2021, and just fantastic. This idea of grief being supported by the cycles is also just absolutely extraordinary. Can you speak a little bit more about like this collaboration? How did this collaboration kind of impact your thinking from the point of working with these other artists till now?
It became another occasion, and in the ways it met up with sort of current events, collective grief, were not necessarily planned things, but that's part of the practice of being an artist, which is to be available to events that are happening in one's own time and place, to also be available to other forms of instruction. I often, one other thing I wanted to actually mention too is that the DVAN, the Diasporic Vietnamese Artist Network, started a pandemic series online. It's like a 2-hour webinar hosted by Viet Nguyen, and the Shoe Has No Masters has a little. Also has an offshoot that I hosted that was called Tea and Tarot, where I used a divinatory practice to have conversation with two other writers of the Vietnamese diaspora. And we're actually going to have another one that's timed for April 12th, when Jupiter is in conjunction with Neptune. But all of these things, I guess I'm bringing that up too, because all of these kinds of activities are linked with constellations of knowledge seeking, knowledge keeping. For me, tarot is also like a deep practice that is also literary, and it's linked to the time I spent in San Francisco, where I studied poetics at New College, which is a program that was started in the 80s by Robert Duncan and Diane DePrima, that were specifically interested in forms of engagement with poetry that was steeped in also like Asian poetics, philosophies and spiritual practices, and speaking with the dead. And that has continued to provide a link to like poetic legacies too, and legacies to like Black Mountain College and San Francisco Renaissance for me was foundational. But they were also drawn into relief by page mothers or mentors that I met during my time there that weren't necessarily institutional connections, but were about a spirit of a place and a spirit of study. And those two figures were Diane DePrima and Joanne Kiger for me, who had these kinds of orientation to also Eastern studies, spiritual studies, philosophies, and poetics, that they took me seriously when I met them as a 20-something-year-old poet. Yeah, so I think it's all tied together with a kind of outlook that understands that poetry is about continuing poetry,
Yes.
and that it's embedded inside of relationships.
Oh, I think embedded inside of relationships.
Yeah.
I think that is a absolutely wonderful segue into the next question, which is, can you speak a little of what are your thoughts toward poetry as activism? When I say poetry as activism, do you believe it is? I mean, how do you see poetry in relation to social change, into the movements that are going on in the world right now?
Well, there are poets who are also activists. Actually, I think of T. Bui, who is part of our collective, and who I read her cards, who during the election was part of efforts to share information, fight disinformation among Vietnamese speakers. And so those kinds of activities are also important, and sometimes they come out of one's commitments inside of poetry, and there's a relationship to them. But I don't feel like there's necessarily one-to-one. And if we would, like, all poets would be aware and interested in forming modes of social change. But I do think that poetry itself as a form, there's a way in which poetry is in its mobile, right? It can be shared body to body. It can be carried as lyric intelligence. It doesn't even necessarily, you don't even necessarily need to be literate. There is a way that poetry also can contain coded resistance by form, by reference, by choices of aesthetic. It can contain all kinds of rigor, intellectual and spiritual rigor. It can be intentionally disruptive with just the choices of how it exposes language's malleability. It can disrupt intentionally by being eccentric. It can cultivate distance through understatement, and actually amplify through a kind of reservation. All of these things, I think, are places where poetry can intervene, and also have us look at things like rulers, like the canon or the colonial archive, that are unchanging or that are resistant to change, and to play inside or play against those, to transmute those, to update those, to posit language against the colonial features of, like, totalitism or essentialism. I also think that poets tend to understand, because of its relationship to economics, right? I mean, picking poetry as one's, well, I always feel like poetry has been my calling. It's something that picked me, really. But the choice in terms of, like, as a career, it's not one that's in line with a kind of exploitation capitalistic model. So there's a way in which poets in particular are called to share an ethos that also considers future generations of readers. I think also too about, like, small press and its function in literary circulation. I was a small press publisher with a journal and a book in print, and then a curatorial practice that grew out of it with an irregular reading series that became actually the last thing that remained when publishing a small press journal and books became too unwieldy for the many jobs. But the ethos has to do with the ways that small press can help develop social outlooks and draw attention to community establishing circulation and the ways in which it can also incubate and circulate marginalized poetics and encourage poetic conspiracies.
Yes.
These are all on the edges of established networks of writing. So there's something about that I feel like is an important piece of poetry, that it's this creative participation of social realities. So that's the kind of site I think that poetry can help solicit. It's forms of listening, forms of dialogue, forms of exchange that can cross barriers in its sort of most hopeful forms.
And I love that you're saying hopeful form in its most hopeful forms. Although I would say yes, yes, and yes to everything that you are mentioning. I actually think an entire class on poetics of social change could come from just your one comment about all the things that you listed, from everything of the shared body to the coded resistance to the poetry picked me. You know, I have an essay coming out about poetry in the cellular, about how it is a full body, it is a somatic experience as artists to create and to also engage in the art of poetry as readers as well. It's unlike other art forms in the way that it can create that participation, as you say, the participation of social realities, which is extremely, extremely important. I feel like I could have an entire class just on some of the elements that you talked about. So thank you so much. What I'm learning from these conversations is the vastness and deepness of this particular topic and how important it is right now in contemporary poetics. And, you know, it has been throughout history, but now we're at a precipice where marginalized voices are having more ability to publish than ever before. We are having our voices heard sort of for the first time in history in a really robust way, not robust enough by any means, but it is getting there. And so I'm gonna transition a little bit, and I hope it's okay. I wanted to share a couple images from A Thousand Times You Lose Your Treasure, only for those who are listening tonight or watching who maybe haven't been exposed to that book yet. I'm going to share my screen here really quickly. See which one I can bring up. And just to show, again, our viewers tonight, so some of the very both intimate archaeology, familial archaeology that you did as part of this book. I didn't know, Hoa, did you want to say a few things about these two particular images?
Yeah, what's interesting, perhaps to me, is that I didn't actually grow up with these images. These surfaced in a scrapbook after my mother died in 2019. I grew up with 4 images that are also included in the book. They're the most sort of kind of poster ready, sort of I think it's just aesthetically arranged. These two, the one on the left with the figure who was my mother riding the wall of death at the highest line, which is the red line, is performing this trick, which is quite dangerous. And she was one of the only performers to do this. She knew about this photo because she brought this scrapbook with her when she left Vietnam in 1968. but then it had gotten sort of lost in the shuffle of life, and it kind of reappeared after her death by another family member. And so I didn't actually have access to either of these images
Mm.
until after I had finished writing the book.
Wow, really?
Yeah.
And I guess that does make sense about where these images come at the very end. And was that very intentional to have the images sort of as kind of as one unit speaking together?
Yeah, I grouped them because the poems aren't one-to-one relationships to the images, and I didn't want because when we read the environment of the book too. So I didn't want to have like necessarily to have poems pitched against images and to have them be read across the image. And so I made a gallery at the back, although I do have one of the images also included as a tipped in postcard with a
Yes.
poem on the back. Yeah.
Yeah, which is, I mean, the tactile nature and the physical nature of this postcard along with the book is absolutely fabulous. And thank you for adding, how about the picture on the right?
On the right, she's traveling down a road wearing some white gloves. This is probably 1958
Okay.
In Vinlong or Kentucky. I think it's in Vinlong, which is the province that folks might know because it's near Ho Chi Minh City, or Ho Chi Minh City's in it.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's you can see some, but I don't know exactly where. So there's always a bit of mystery. It's interesting that these actually also sort of appeared as a sort of a late apparition,
Yeah.
because it is a kind of cartography of ghosts. There's a number of ghosts that make appearances, and including sort of like the ghosts of silence and trauma, which aren't necessarily voiced, but are given a space of articulation without being centered as violence.
Yeah, thank you. Well, and thank you for bringing that up, because that actually leads into, in reading this book. So I have a little bit of a setup for this next question, is that in reading your book, there is so much sacred and haunting sort of coexisting at the exact same time in these poems. And there's an honoring of your mother, and the all-woman stunt motorcycle group that she belonged to, but also this relentlessness of the Vietnamese diaspora, about Vietnam, about place, about language, ghost stories, poetic forms, the incantations of familial histories and narratives, but the cultural and societal ones as well. I just found, the fractured, the specificity in the words and combination, to be, through sound, imagery, juxtaposition, to just be stunning in this book. These are dense and intense worlds that really ache and claw at a reader in the most like gorgeous of ways. And also, talking about violence and talking about very, very difficult topics. And so like your poem, and I'm gonna, if it's okay with you, I would like to read this poem out loud, Napalm Notes. Napalm Notes. Developed in secret at Harvard, produced by Dow Chemical, an efficient incendiary formula, perfected on Valentine's Day, 1942, a thickened, gasoline can be dropped from planes, napalm bombs, also flamethrowers. 8 million tons of bombs in Vietnam, burns at 1,500 to 2,200 degrees Fahrenheit, 1/5 as hot as the surface of the sun. Very sticky, stable, also relatively cheap. this is just one example in this book of the visceral and striking pieces that are leaping in language and imagery, but pulling us through a very intense story simultaneously. Now, with that very long setup, while I'm curious on how you see social change manifesting in your art and your own creative processes.
Yeah, well, thanks for highlighting that poem. I think that actually maybe is a good example of what I was saying about a kind of aesthetic choice that can also create a container that uses gestures of tonal angularity, the formality in that poem. I think it pervades it, and it creates that kind of understated, cultivated reserve that helps to create, not only share information about that particular war instrument, but places it in history. I think people are often surprised to learn how it was developed, its attributes, and its timing of development actually was used in World War II to great destruction in Tokyo. But you know, the book is one that I had thought of for a very long time, but actually didn't have access to all the materials that I needed to complete the work that I think actually benefited from social change that comes through that came through art. Certainly benefited from my relationships to the Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network, and the efforts that the founders and the participants in collectives like those have made to highlight the stories that are often marginalized, even though they're right there. They're really not on the margin at all, but they've been flattened, you know. So I think that work that's been an ongoing work and will continue to be ongoing helped to give me the tools or access to my own ability to represent a diasporic experience that hadn't been shared before. But it was definitely inspired in part to, I mean, of course, to feature aspects of my mother's life. She was the celebrated stunt motorcycle rider. I mean, that's such a great, striking sort of proposal, right? And she dramatically leaves, you know, the country, leaves her language, brings with her her mixed race child, me, and then never returns home. So all these things that are quite compelling sort of aspects of story are ones that I wanted to tell, but I wanted to tell it not as, well, I like to quote Jack Spicer, who says he wanted to approach that poetry's job is to approach history not as an embalmer, but a time mechanic. So I was interested in how, I mean, linking this to this idea of social change, because it's also about featuring an Asian American woman at the center of her own story, right? Complicated. And she's not, you know, a victim, a villain, or a sex worker in her own story. She has a name and she has a backstory. These are things that generally aren't provided from women of my mother's generation in Anglophone storytelling. So there is this interest in a kind of feminist attention to narrate migration and dispossession, and also social waywardness. You know, my mother made very socially wayward choices in her life. To be able to also have encounters with the ruler, with the archive, and sort of offer through matrilineage, which also seems like a kind of radical gesture, ways to commune with the dead and also imagine lives and create a kind of mosaic to dislodge ghosts and create possibilities, and insist on presence. I think that's the big thing, because I think a lot of writers of color, BIPOC writers, can feel that their presence is often minimized or monolithic. And this idea of being able to disrupt those narratives by offering counter narratives, by worlding, I think, to use your world, to also use language itself and to interrogate it also, and point to its own slipperiness and implication is part of my charge.
Yeah, the implication, and also the implication and the interrogation of language that, and also one would say, like, truth at times, truth is so much tied to who had the ability in history to tell stories, who had the ability to create what truth or accuracy was, and to be reclaiming that through people of color, through people with disabilities, queer and trans individuals. Feels like the time that we are not just, the insistence, I think, is coming out, where we are no longer able to just sort of stand for what our parents' generations and the generations before have allowed to happen, and disrupting narratives by dominant narratives, by giving actual narratives of lives and existence and what it feels like to have, I was thinking of the waywardness, the migration, to be a refugee, to almost have crossing borders as part of one's lineage and at a cellular level. And I'm going to actually move to, you're beginning to talk about this. So what role do you think imagination, and specifically imagination in the arts, play in the invention and radicalization of a world where BIPOC and marginalized people's liberation fully exists and is fully actualized?
It's interesting. I think that my mind, for me, goes not so much to the act of writing and producing writing, but also the classroom, and also a kind of focus on how work is circulated, how work is centered, how it's approved of. I was thinking in preparation to this, I was thinking about, it wasn't that long ago, like in 2016, there were still syllabus for poetry, creative writing classes in storied institutions that had no writers of color on it.
Yeah.
No. I think of panels, that were also homogenous in various ways. I think of practitioners whose work, were using colonial settler language in unexamined ways, or white supremacy language in unexamined ways, and that I was looking back at the Mongrel Coalition, who were an anonymous body, speaking of collectivity, anonymous body of activists who were calling out, it was like 2016, right? Calling out, these sort of literary power centers and poets also who were working in ways that they found objectionable, and were quite playful and shady in the ways that they would call out practitioners who, were using blackface, who were using the autopsy of Michael Brown in ways that were objectionable and so on, to kind of press um, to press us into seeing what is actually there. I mean, poetry, I think, always challenges the status quo that way. In part because it's available in those ways, like I was saying, in terms of it being able to be circulated, but also what it does at the level of the imagination, with play and invention. But that also includes examining the ethos, and I do feel that so much of the progress that we've had so far have been, from the BIPOC writers that have come before us. So I guess I want to say, like, role of the imagination is really important, and also the criticality to understand what the shared ethos is, and to be really quite honest about it, and challenge power, which is really hard, because if you're a BIPOC person, you often aren't in a situation where you can challenge, which is why the Mongrel Coalition was successful, in that they were anonymous, like the Guerrilla Girls, or these other group formations that whose purpose is to challenge how work is circulated and who's centered. And it's really, I really look at that period and think how much pedagogically we've also shifted, in terms of, like, the workshop. We just, in the last couple of years, I feel like a lot of reclamation has been happening, to sort of decanonize and recenter artists and writers who had been doing the work, but who hadn't been featured, or whose work had been cut off by violence and not featured. I'm thinking of Kathy Park Hong's Minor Feelings, and the way that it's brought renewed interest to a wider audience on Dictée and Chaw's work, whose work has always been important to poets, but more and more artists and writers are finding her work, in large part because of that type of insistence on visibility.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, what are your thoughts then around the evolution of contemporary poetry in the upcoming years? And do you see the landscape of poetry transforming in the wake of this relentless violence that we see toward Asian American and Pacific Islanders, Black, brown, and trans queer people? Do you feel an urgency continuing to rise?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always been urgent, and the violence has always been relentless. I think one of the things that has changed is the visibility, the circulating of information has changed, so that the urgency or the awareness has a chance to go farther, be more effective. I'm just thinking about it's discouraging, because it's almost as though it needs to rely on the actual, like, traumatized body for change, right? I'm thinking here in Canada, how the revelations of what had been known for a long time among Indigenous people and people who understood what the residential school system wrought. It took the actual finding of bodies to instigate more change that can be seen, that's more visible. And I'm thinking back to the murders that I mentioned earlier on March 16th, the killings in Atlanta. That was also the anniversary of the My Lai massacre. And so when that happened, also my book was was being released. And so there was also this, a lot of attention to like my book, which also like features an Asian woman's body and is considering the ways in which, colonialism impacted my mother's life, and then the American war in Vietnam impacted, but then also didn't. It also, was a much more complicated story. But that the thing I think that we're starting to, evolve our understanding inside of poetry is the ways in which these connections between, um, you know, this hate crime um, and this war crime over here that kind of individualizes the problem rather than seeing it as a systemic and cultural one. And I think that that's one of the functions that poetry has been able to sort of present. It's always like a presentation, really, poetry, right? It's not necessarily like a lecture or an essay of persuasion, but it's a form of presentation that can rehumanize or retextualize or become a representation, so that it removes that aspect of one dimensionality. Because when a culture is only presented one dimensionally, the people then are removed from a contemporary society, or only in service to dominant narratives, for example. I think of other forms of media. I mean, think of poetry as a medium, like television shows that would show like the Korean War, but it was only told from the perspective of U.S. American doctors who served during the Korean War, and culture of Korea weren't shown, or the history of the place was not not shared, and the Korean actors were not featured or had names. And similarly, like in my book, which took, you read, thankfully, with gratitude, the names of my previous books, and none of my previous books had at its core featuring those kinds of diasporic experience who were interested in other things. And certainly those themes were there, but they were not made writ large. They were not legible in the largest way. And so there's a way in which poetry can offer that space. But it took me a long time, like I said, for me to um, finally be able to activate that motivation to counter those stories or lack of stories.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and wow, I'm so glad you bring this up, because I know that I commend and I'm just in awe of earlier career poets who are able to write about trauma and violence and their personal and identity histories right away. Where, I mean, it took me 40 years to be able to write about some of the familial trauma, but also just about my own history and some of my own identities, and that took time to cultivate. And it really is, I wrote a lot of other manuscripts before that one came along, and it's interesting how subtextually those dynamics of social change may be in our work at all points in time, but whether it surfaces fully in an entire manuscript is sort of a completely different story. This A Thousand Times You Lose Your Treasure is just a phenomenal work of art, in my opinion, and has moved me in so many different ways, but also for me represents art as activism in a very palpable way. The last question I want to ask, and then I'll open it up for a few minutes to see if anyone in the audience has questions for you, is what makes you the most hopeful about poetry as an art form right now? What gives you hope in poetry?
I would have to say, seeing the works of my peers, I hesitate to even start to name people because I'll leave 100 people out, but seeing works that take on these aspects of new narrations that I'm thinking of, like Don Mi Choi's DMZ Colony and Hardly War, but also her translation of Kim Hai-soon, these kind of global perspectives, cross-border perspectives. I think of Susan Briante's Defacing the Monument. I think of Renee Gladman, who's also like working the boundary between writing and visual art. I think of Simone White. I think of Kinesia Lubrin, Billy Ray Belcourt, all of my diasporic sisters associated with She Who Has No Masters. I think of a growing attention to poetics of relation. I see this also in my students, that they're pushing against fixity and colonial settler mindsets very purposely, thinking about narrative as relation, thinking of storytelling modes as that invite other kinds of forms of understanding against like closed loops of understanding. Also, the welcome opacities, I think is really important. The ways that one might need to stay illegible, stay irreducible. These are all exciting sort of things that I'm noticing among practitioners, the ways in which there's like a troubling of reductionism of place, person, or idea. It's exciting.
Agreed. And there's so much fantastic work that is sort of pushing, I think, at what poetry is, what it can be, and also at where humanity needs to go for any type of liberation. And I think it's moving now in a way that for me is unbelievably exciting.
Yeah, there's a new exciting series too that Coffee House edited. It's curated by Ken Chen, and it's called the Spatial
Is
Series.
that where Aisha Sabatini Sloan's book came out?
Yeah.
Yes.
That's the one. And I love this idea of like another ways of thinking through place in particular.
Yes, and I love how much you bring up place, and sort of everything that you've talked about. Place seems to be one of sort of the many orbs in which contemplation comes through in such an important way.
Mm-hmm.
We do have a little bit of time. Thank you all for joining us, and we're open to some questions. So it looks like we do have one question in the chat right now from Mars Robinson. Often communities of color can be juxtaposed against each other socially and in the framing of social events. A lot of artistic work exists to undermine this perspective. Still, what is the best way for a young artist to create bridges between their community and others facing oppression?
Wonderful question. I know I'm often thinking about those responsibilities and those commitments. You know, I'm not going to have a brilliant answer. It sounds like you're actually already doing the work and thinking of the question. That's part of the work. And also, I really rely on like my closest reliable people. It always starts with the small and goes out to the large. So, and that's one of the reasons why I'm interested in place too, because here we are, and it's like what it's like really this like right outside. But like the closest relationships that you have can be the things that help you activate across barriers as well. I think definitely looking to other sites of formations. A metaphor that I was given through by virtue of Joanne Kiger, who who got it from Robert Duncan, is the idea of the hearth. And so I always think of that in terms of community formation, is to find the people that are keeping hearths. And then it's like visiting these others and like making ways in which you can cross over into that. There are organizations that have been, I think, instrumental in trying to create those connections between. I think that's really important.
Thank you. And thank you for your question. Are there any other questions that people can put either in the chat or in, oh, thank you. We have one from Violetta Orozco. I loved your comment on forms of spiritual understanding that have been pushed aside by settler colonialist narratives. Would you be able to expand on everyday spiritual practice that influence your writing or that show up in your writing?
Thanks, Violetta. That's a great question. They change. I think that I've always been drawn to the extrasensory, supernatural, the things that are not necessarily captured by episteme and Western modes of thinking. I've understood their relevance and their importance and their value by temperament or stubbornness or stance. I'm not sure which one would be first. So for me, one of my first sort of spiritual practices that was connecting myself to both a large history to reference is the ancient book, the I Ching, which is an oracle. And there's a whole set of things that you do to arrive at your fortune. And sometimes the word language is hard to share, but that you may be familiar with. But it's not as though I throw my coins, that's how you derive your hexagram, and on any kind of regimented practice. It's very loose and lived, you know. But tarot is also another form which I mentioned earlier. But it's really a kind of orientation. But the Tao Te Ching was a really critical book to me, because I understood like an intimacy of like the philosophy that also recognized like the living matter of the universe and the living matter of everything. And then I also understood, I think on an intuitive level, I understood how these practices, like, as you say, were not only pushed aside, but are actively criticized and diminished. Narratives and practices, any kind of witchery, anything, especially if it's matrilineal, if it's knowledge that's shared by women or people who are informally educated. So I think I've always had that kind of spirit, and I've always sought out practices that also have like really long histories of involved scholarship. So if you've done any kind of looking at star knowledge, there's many forms. There's many books, and there are whole worlds of reference. I'm fond of forms of astrology. I know that it connects me to my great grandfather, who was a star knower. He was the person in his village that people would go to for advice about when to do something and when not to do something. He basically told people, you know, when it was okay to plant, and these are deeply held knowledges, and I honor them through my practices. But they tend to be not strict. They're permissive and felt, and I think that they influence my writing in many ways, they're very suggestive. You know, tarot cards, the I Ching. I named my book 1,000 times You Lose Your Treasure because of a hexagram that I threw when I first started writing the book in earnestness. I drew hexagram 53, which is thunder over thunder, shock, the rousing thunder shock. Then I didn't like the hexagram I drew, so I threw my hexagram 2 more times, and I still drew the same one, which is like a kind of an improbability, impossible improbability. So I understood I needed to pay attention to this particular sign. So it's really about reading like symbolic language, being available to symbolic language. But then the double thunder Chen, the fortune that you get with it is it's 100,000 times you lose your treasure, but it's really about how your treasure comes back, but that the mode you have to adapt is mutability. And then it also coincided with getting the Tower card, and significantly right before I was about to leave for Vietnam for the first time, which helped orient me towards subject matter. But I think more importantly was for me to encounter a motorcycle troupe that was performing the same exact act as my mother's by accident as I wandered into a park. And it was my Tower moment of discovery, of suddenly like having the information flood at me unexpectedly. And then the Tower became this motif that came back. Right now, I'm doing a practice where I walk to, well, not right now because it's really cold and icky outside, but when the weather's nice, I walk down to a lake that's an oxbow lake. And there's a poem in 1,000 Times Your Treasure where it's a kind of meditation that's inspired by my long love oxbow lakes. And I visit it, and I had this whole kind of communication between a staghorn sumac drupe, which is the fruit of a sumac tree, and a calendula plant that I ended up growing from that vernal equinox ritual that I had performed, that I harvested some of the seeds and flower tops, and I put with the drupe into a little lantern that I keep on my windowsill and charge by the moon. So I do all kinds of different things, and they get inside of poems because they're part of how I'm training my attentions. And I think that's really where poets get everything is what we're obsessed about.
Our obsessions emerge whether we want them to or not. And we are so, I'm so grateful that they find their way into your poems. We are out of time, and to honor everyone who has shared space tonight, thank you so much. Hoa, thank you so much for your thoughts, your words, your art, and sharing this space with us tonight.
Thank you. And thank you for everyone for coming. I see so many names that I recognize, and I just appreciate you so much. Yeah. Including people that I wish I had said in that answer to your last question, like Liz Howard.
It's impossible to list them all, right? And so again, thank you for being here. Do note that on the Conversations website, there are discussions that are posted from Jennifer S. Chang and also Dr. Joshua Bennett. We will be having 2 or 3 other conversations coming up with Dr. Danica Kelly, Hyde Eid Erdrich, and Dr. Craig Santos Perez, as we continue to explore the art form of poetry as a catalyst for social change. Thank you all so much for joining, and have a lovely evening. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Felicia.
Bye, Hoa.
Bye.